They thought it was just another field. In the spring of 1991, farmers plowing the soil outside a small Baltic town struck something hard. At first, they believed it was rock. But when they dug deeper, the earth revealed what no one was supposed to see. Bones, piled together, tangled with scraps of rotting cloth and rusted buttons. It wasn't one body. It wasn't even 10. It was hundreds. And for decades, everyone had been told these places did not exist. The Soviet collapse had just begun to peel back the layers of silence, and beneath them lay the darkest secrets of Eastern Europe. Entire communities had carried the weight of whispered rumors, disappearances in the night, families torn apart, convoys that never returned. Officially, nothing happened. Unofficially, the land itself remembered. The mass graves did not lie. What those farmers found was only the beginning. In forests, pits, abandoned quarries, and old military zones, thousands of bodies lay hidden, victims of executions so secret that even the archives avoided naming them. Soldiers, teachers, priests, women accused of betrayal, men suspected of sympathizing with the enemy, all swallowed by the ground, all erased from history books. These were not battle deaths. They were killings meant to disappear people, to erase entire categories of life. A hidden war inside the war, carried out quietly, swiftly, and always denied. For nearly half a century, the world was not meant to know. And yet, the truth was there, waiting to be uncovered. The question was never whether these crimes happened, but how long it would take for anyone to dare to dig deep enough. If you want the rest of this buried story to be unearthed, make sure you subscribe and follow along, because what comes next will change the way you think about the end of World War II. By the summer of 1944, Eastern Europe was already drowning in fire. The Red Army was advancing westward, city after city collapsing into rubble as the Wehrmacht retreated. But in the chaos of liberation, something darker unfolded, something carefully hidden beneath the triumph of victory. Entire towns whispered about people who vanished overnight. Neighbors would see a cart rolling down the road at dusk, men with rifles escorting those accused of collaboration. And by morning, the houses stood empty, the doors swinging in the wind. The war had already brutalized these lands. Nazi occupation had meant mass shootings, deportations, slave labor. Villages had been burned, families exterminated. But what came next carried a different cruelty. It wasn't the blind destruction of invasion, nor the frenzied violence of retreat. It was systematic. It was organized. And it was meant to leave no trace. As the Soviets reclaimed territories from the Baltic states down through Poland, Belarus, and into Ukraine, their political police, the NKVD, moved in behind the front lines. Their mission was not simply to re-establish order. It was to cleanse. Lists were drawn up with names of anyone who had ever spoken to a German officer, worked in a local administration, or even failed to show enough enthusiasm for Moscow's return. Teachers, priests, minor officials, farmers who had accepted German rations, suddenly, all were labeled enemies. At first, arrests were quiet. Men pulled from their homes at night, women questioned for hours in small offices lit by a single lamp. Some returned, hollow-eyed, broken by beatings. Many did not. Whispers said they had been taken to the forests, where trucks unloaded them at pits dug hastily in advance. In one Polish town near Białystok, villagers remembered the sound of engines after midnight, the headlights sweeping across the trees, then silence, until gunfire cracked in the distance. By dawn, the trucks were gone, and the only evidence was the churned soil near the clearing. No graves were marked. Families who asked too many questions soon joined the missing. The fear spread like smoke. People learned not to talk, not to ask, not even to whisper. Survival meant pretending nothing had happened. But everyone noticed the gaps. The baker who no longer opened his shop, the church choir missing half its voices, the school teacher whose desk remained empty. And these were not isolated events. Across Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, mass roundups erased entire groups accused of betrayal. In Belarus, hundreds of villages saw their men vanish after screenings conducted by Soviet officers. In western Ukraine, local leaders were dragged away as nationalists, accused of plotting resistance. Some had fought alongside the Germans, yes. Others were guilty only of wanting independence from both Moscow and Berlin. But to the NKVD, nuance did not matter. Suspicion was enough to justify a bullet. To the outside world, none of this existed. Official reports spoke only of liberation, of rebuilding, of fascists driven out. The Red Army was celebrated as savior, and in many ways, it was, ending the nightmare of Nazi rule. But in the shadows of that triumph, another war raged. A war against memory, identity, and survival. Those who carried out the executions followed strict routines. Trucks with covered beds transported prisoners under guard. Groups of 20, 50, sometimes hundreds, were led into secluded forests. Forced to dig if pits weren't already prepared, they were lined up at the edge. Some were shot from behind, quick and efficient. Others were forced to kneel as officers walked past, pressing pistols to the back of each skull in turn. The bodies tumbled into the ground, layer upon layer, until earth was shoveled back over them. The goal was silence, final and absolute. But the silence was imperfect. Children hiding in bushes saw the glow of cigarettes before the firing began. Farmers found scraps of clothing while cutting timber. Streams carried bones when heavy rains washed away thin soil. And still, people said nothing. They couldn't. The punishment for speaking was the same as the punishment for collaboration. Death without record, without grave. Decades later, when the first graves were uncovered in the 1990s, villagers finally admitted what they had seen as children. Long columns of people marched into the woods, guarded by armed men, never to return. The echoes of gunfire, they said, had haunted their dreams for half a century. At the time, though, in 1944 and 1945, survival depended on silence. Families learned to erase the names of the missing, to pretend they had never existed. Letters were burned, photographs hidden in attics or buried in jars beneath gardens. To admit that your father, your brother, your husband had been taken was to risk sharing his fate. The front lines rolled onward, deeper into Germany, and the world celebrated victory. But in the villages left behind, mass graves cooled in the earth, unmarked, unacknowledged. What had begun as liberation was becoming something else. A second occupation, one that demanded not only loyalty, but forgetfulness. And for those who lived through it, the fear was not just of soldiers or secret police. It was of the ground itself, which held too many secrets, waiting for the day it would be forced to give them back. The massacres were not random bursts of violence. They followed patterns, cold, repetitive, designed to erase lives without leaving traces. Entire regions carried their own hidden scars. In Latvia, local witnesses later recalled how the NKVD used abandoned German trenches as mass graves. Prisoners were marched out in small groups, forced to kneel, and executed one by one. Villagers working nearby fields could hear the muffled cracks of rifles, followed by the dull thud of dirt thrown over bodies. The trenches that once held soldiers now swallowed civilians. In Lithuania, a farmer's son remembered being woken by dogs barking in the middle of the night. From the window, he saw trucks with covered backs driving toward the forest road. The next day, his father found pieces of rope and bloodied cloth in the clearing. "We never spoke of it," the man confessed half a century later. "We were afraid the forest would repeat our words." Belarus bore some of the heaviest wounds. Villages that had already endured German atrocities faced a second terror. Soviet partisans, once hailed as heroes, now helped identify locals accused of having traded food with the occupiers or spoken to German soldiers. Entire families disappeared in single nights. Survivors described the sound of boots on wooden porches, orders barked in Russian, and the pleading of neighbors who were never seen again. Some were taken to improvised prisons in barns or schools, interrogated for days before being driven into the woods. Others were executed immediately, the ground of nearby fields trembling with gunfire. Western Ukraine became another graveyard. Here, the line between resistance fighter and civilian blurred. Any hint of nationalist sympathy was enough to brand a person an enemy. A shopkeeper in Lviv was accused simply because his shelves once carried German goods. A priest was denounced for delivering sermons that did not praise the Soviet Union. Students suspected of joining underground groups were pulled from classrooms and vanished without trial. Years later, mass pits near towns like Vinnytsia and Rivne revealed hundreds of skeletons. Some bound at the wrists, some still with rosaries tangled in their ribs. Testimonies of rare survivors brought the horror into sharper focus. In Poland, a man named Janusz, captured on suspicion of aiding the Germans, described how he was forced into a truck with 40 others. They were driven to a remote quarry. There, guards separated them into groups of 5. Each group was ordered to stand at the edge. The shots came quickly. Janusz fell into the pit before the bullet meant for him fired. Bodies crashed down over him. He lay still, suffocating under the weight of corpses, until night fell, and the guards left. Crawling out, bloodied and broken, he wandered for days before finding shelter. For decades he stayed silent, telling no one, fearing the secret police. Only in the 1990s did he finally speak. Others were less fortunate. In one Estonian town, a school teacher and her 2 daughters were accused of writing letters to German relatives. They were taken from their home at night. Weeks later, children playing near the river found a shoe with a woman's foot still inside. The rest of their bodies were never recovered. The killers moved with routine precision. First the arrests, then the interrogation, then the transport. Victims were told they were being resettled or relocated. Some believed it until the last moment, carrying small bundles of clothes or food. Then came the pits, sometimes already dug by earlier prisoners, sometimes hastily carved out with shovels. People were lined up. Officers walked down the line with pistols, aiming at the back of the head. Riflemen fired volleys into groups. The soil was pushed over quickly, as if covering evidence rather than honoring the dead. But the land resisted silence. Heavy rains washed away shallow earth, exposing bones to the surface. Farmers plowing fields struck skulls. Children stumbled across rusted belt buckles, identity tags, shoes still holding skeletal feet. Families marked these places in secret. Small crosses hidden in groves, flowers left at the edge of clearings, acts of defiance carried out with trembling hands. Everywhere, the pattern was the same. Arrest, disappearance, silence. And the silence was the cruelest weapon. Villagers lived beside the unmarked graves, knowing exactly what lay beneath, yet forbidden to speak. Those who dared to whisper risked joining the dead. The forests of Eastern Europe became both shelter and cemetery, filled with echoes of gunfire that no one admitted hearing. Decades later, when excavations began, the pits revealed the truth with chilling clarity. Layers of skeletons pressed together, some with hands tied behind their backs, some with blindfolds still intact. In Venezia alone, more than 9,000 bodies were unearthed in a single site. In the Baltics, pits contained men, women, and children alike. Each grave told the same story. Executions carried out not in rage, not in the chaos of battle, but in cold, organized silence. For those who survived, the memories never faded. They spoke of footsteps in the night, the last cries of neighbors, the smell of fresh earth turned over too quickly, and always the silence that followed, heavier than the gunfire, heavier than the graves themselves. For decades after the guns fell silent, the earth of Eastern Europe kept its secrets. Villages lived with ghosts they were not allowed to name. Everyone knew who had disappeared in 1944 or 1945. Yet to mention it aloud was to invite ruin. Under Soviet control, silence became survival. The NKVD and later the KGB ensured it. Files were sealed. Questions went unanswered. Official histories described nothing but liberation, triumph, and the march towards socialism. If a man had vanished, the explanation was simple. He had been taken by the fascists, or relocated, or perhaps fallen in the war. Families who pressed further found doors slammed in their faces. Some were threatened. Some lost jobs, homes, even children, all for refusing to bury their grief in silence. The fear was not imaginary. In Poland, widows of the disappeared who asked about their husbands were themselves arrested as sympathizers. In Lithuania, a priest who delivered a sermon for the souls of the missing was dragged away in the middle of Mass. In Ukraine, entire families who privately lit candles at graves suspected of being execution sites later vanished. The message was clear. The dead would remain buried, and so would the truth. But the memories refused to die. Old women whispered to children, "Your uncle lies in that forest." Farmers pointed out clearings where no trees grew straight, saying, "The ground there does not sleep." Even as people built homes and schools, they avoided certain patches of earth, too afraid or too respectful to disturb them. Folklore blended with fact. Legends grew of cursed woods where no birds sang, rivers that carried voices, or fields that wept blood after heavy rains. These were not myths. They were the only language left to describe what everyone knew but could not say. The psychological toll was enormous. Entire generations grew up with gaps in their families. Uncles who never returned, grandparents who existed only in fading photographs, siblings whose names were spoken only in locked rooms. Mothers told children not to ask questions, not to say names outside the home. Silence became tradition, handed down like an heirloom. In some cases, the repression was active. In Belarus, when villagers secretly erected wooden crosses near suspected grave sites, the crosses were torn down within days by authorities. In Latvia, flowers placed at the edge of forests were removed, the ground leveled to erase any sign of mourning. Soviet soldiers sometimes camped directly atop suspected execution grounds, ensuring no one dared approach. Still, small acts of defiance persisted. In western Ukraine, villagers marked sites with stones arranged in patterns only they could recognize. In Estonia, families made pilgrimages to certain groves under the guise of berry picking, leaving scraps of cloth or coins as offerings. In Poland, whispers passed from grandmother to granddaughter. When it is safe, dig there. These secret traditions preserved memory through decades of enforced amnesia. But the silence corroded daily life. People learned to mistrust neighbors, unsure of who had denounced whom. Fear divided communities, leaving wounds that lasted long after the Soviet Union fell. A man might be respected by day, yet whispered about by night as the one who had once pointed a finger that condemned an entire family. The graves beneath the soil did not only bury the dead, they buried trust itself. And the children grew into adults, carrying questions they dared not ask. Why was father's name never mentioned at gatherings? Why did grandmother cry when passing the forest edge? Why were certain places avoided, even when food was scarce and land was needed? Entire nations carried this weight, pretending not to see what was plain before their eyes. The official silence lasted nearly 50 years. Only in the late 1980s, with glasnost and the slow collapse of Soviet authority, did whispers turn into voices. Local activists began organizing quiet searches. Old men, finally too weary to carry secrets, pointed to clearings and said, "Here, dig here." At first, only a few bones emerged, pale against the black earth. Then entire skeletons surfaced, bound at the wrists, bullet holes drilled through skulls. By then, survivors were elderly. Their hands trembled as they described the night convoys, the cries of neighbors, the muffled shots. Some broke down, ashamed of their long silence. Others spoke with anger, demanding the world finally acknowledge what they had carried for half a century. The land had kept its testimony. And when the silence finally cracked, it poured out in waves, an entire hidden history demanding to be seen. The truth had always been there, written in the forests, the fields, and the rivers. It only waited for someone brave enough to look. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, the soil began to speak. In the early 1990s, teams of archaeologists, journalists, and ordinary villagers gathered with shovels, determined to uncover what had been denied for so long. The first digs were hesitant, carried out almost in secret. But as bones surfaced, tangled in clothing and rosaries, with shoes still laced on skeletal feet, the silence of decades shattered. Entire villages stood around the pits, some weeping, some stone-faced, all of them staring at the proof of what they had always known. In Lithuania, excavations outside Tuskulėnai revealed over 700 bodies in a single site. Victims of NKVD executions carried out in the late 1940s. In Belarus, the forests of Kurapati, on the outskirts of Minsk, yielded mass graves estimated to hold tens of thousands. Excavators pulled skull after skull from the earth, many with single bullet holes at the base. In Latvia and Estonia, forest clearings turned into cemeteries as local commissions unearthed remains of priests, teachers, and farmers. Ordinary people executed in extraordinary numbers. Poland's forests gave up their own secrets, including pits outside Białystok filled with bound skeletons still clutching crucifixes. The scale was overwhelming. Each grave was not just a collection of bones, but a collection of silenced lives. Families erased, communities broken. Forensic specialists cataloged buttons, coins, eyeglasses, wedding rings. These fragments told stories the killers had tried to erase. A child's shoe lying next to a mother's skeleton, a rosary clenched in stiffened fingers, bullet casings scattered among ribs. Every detail testified to the same truth. These were not casualties of war, but deliberate executions, carried out methodically and buried under lies. With glasnost and independence, survivors finally spoke openly. Men who had been children in the 1940s described watching their fathers taken away, never to return. Women recounted waiting for husbands who had been promised short questioning. Priests told of entire parishes emptied in single nights. The grief, bottled for half a century, erupted in public. Newspapers printed testimonies, ceremonies were held, and crosses were erected on soil that had once been guarded with rifles. But even as the truth surfaced, justice proved elusive. Many of the perpetrators were long dead. Others had lived out comfortable retirements, never charged, never named. For the families of the victims, the graves brought answers, but not closure. "Now we know where they are," one daughter said as she laid flowers at a pit near Vilnius. "But we will never know why it was allowed to happen." The revelations rippled beyond Eastern Europe. International observers compared the findings to Katyn, the massacre of Polish officers the Soviets denied for decades. Suddenly, the scale of repression across the region became undeniable. The myth of liberation without blood collapsed. What emerged was a darker truth. The end of the war had brought not peace, but another kind of terror. Even today, the scars remain. Forests across Lithuania, Belarus, Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltics are dotted with memorials. Small wooden crosses, stone markers, plaques with names where names could be recovered. But countless pits still lie undiscovered, known only to the earth. Locals still speak of bad places, patches of soil avoided for generations. The dead wait there, nameless, until someone dares to uncover them. The secret mass executions of Eastern Europe were not just crimes of the past. They were crimes against memory itself, attempts to erase entire lives from history. But memory endured, in whispers, in silence, in the stubborn refusal of the land to keep its secrets forever. And when the truth finally came out, it changed everything. It proved that no regime, however powerful, can bury history forever. The ground itself will speak, and when it does, it demands to be heard. What was meant to be hidden is now part of the world's record. The silence has broken. The dead have spoken, and the living must listen.